It was supposed to be a sure thing. When North Korea sent its soldiers to Kursk, Russian President Vladimir Putin was all but certain that he would be able to change the tide of the Ukrainian invasion and hasten the victory he had assured for Russia. But the reality was far from what he expected. Putin's vision of steamrolling through Ukraine ground to a halt when the North Korean troops actually got there in mid-October 2024. What arrived were not elite modern soldiers, but run-of-the-mill infantrymen who would need months of additional training, and even that didn't save them from the utter embarrassment both on and off the battlefield. Now, some 5 months later, Putin has thrown in the towel with the North Korean plan and recalled them from the front. But what does that mean for the troops who were stationed in Kursk? And how did the North Korean soldiers manage to not influence the combat at all? And is there a hidden reason behind Putin's sudden change of strategy? Let's dig into the ongoing issues with North Koreans, what problems their deployment was trying to solve, and whether we might see more of them later. First, let's start with the news that North Koreans are officially being pulled away from the front lines. The reports came from South Korea's intelligence agency, one which frequently reported on North Korean movements and actions throughout the war, both militarily and economically. According to the report, the troops were withdrawn after suffering heavy losses. The retreat is not determined to be final, as there's no telling what Putin's long-term plans might be, but it would seem that North Korea might be done fighting directly for Russia, at least for the next few months. So how heavy were the casualties that the North Koreans incurred? Let's start with the number of troops who were sent at the start. While the reports on the number of troops shipped vary, most outlets agree that between 10,000 and 12,000 soldiers were sent from North Korea to Kursk. All of these soldiers were spotted inside Russia all the way back in October 2024, first in the Outer Manchuria region, which borders North Korea, then in the Kursk region itself a few months later. The same report that mentions the withdrawal also states that about 300 of those soldiers have been killed and about 2,700 injured, with a relatively negligible number captured by the Ukrainian military. If we take the medium number of troops present at 11,000 men and a total number of losses at 3,000, that's about a 35% casualty rate for the North Korean troops. Frankly, this seems too low of a number for multiple reasons, suggesting that the North Koreans were severely underutilized compared to the native Russian troops. There are a few different reasons why this may have happened, and they mainly revolve around the existing state of the North Korean army. North Korea is perhaps one of the best examples of an army that takes quantity to the extreme while shoving quality to the deep trenches to die, much like the North Korean soldiers often did in Kursk. As a country with around 26 million people, its military numbers over 1.32 million troops, making it a country with one of the highest conscription rates in the world. Compare this to the US, which has 1.3 million troops out of 340 million people, or China with its 2 million troops from over 1.4 billion residents. North Korea's aggressive conscription policy, which requires most men to serve for a decade and women up to the age of 23 for at least 5 years, also means the country has one of the largest reserve forces in the world. It's estimated that North Korea could draft more than a third of the country in wartime. And yet that all means pretty much nothing when we dive into the actual state of the troops in question. First, the country's military technology is far behind the curve. Most of the country's supplies and equipment come directly from the Soviet Union. Not Russia itself, but the Soviet Union, a country that disappeared around 35 years ago. That means that most of North Korea's armored vehicles, its paltry fleet of aircraft, and infantry equipment are all designs that are by now considered obsolete. Even if the country's military has carefully maintained this equipment, considering that they haven't seen active use in decades, they're likely quickly approaching their breaking points. When it comes to new designs, it's uncertain how much manufacturing capacity North Korea has for military equipment, as most of its designs seem to harken back to the Soviet era anyway. This lack of technology is perpetuated in the equipment that North Korean soldiers used in Kursk. Without access to the modern gear that Russia's soldiers were using, North Koreans were given old equipment by Russia, or in most cases, using what they originally arrived with. This puts them miles behind the contemporary Ukrainian soldiers, and was likely why they couldn't really do much more than bulk up the numbers in the Kursk counteroffensive that Russia tried to pilot since late September. However, the lack of technology is far from the only issue that the North Korean troops had. On a deeper level, the old military tactics that North Korea drills into its soldiers were also a hindrance. The last time the country was in an active conflict was 1953, when the ceasefire with South Korea was reached. From that point, there doesn't seem to have been much progress in terms of military preparedness, strategy, and tactics from North Korea. As a glaring example, the North Korean troops in Kursk were woefully unprepared to combat Ukrainian drones, a strategy that has, at that point, become the hallmark of the entire war effort. Worse yet, Russia itself has used drones in similar ways before, so it's obvious that the Russian military spent no effort to prepare the North Korean troops before they were actually shipped to an active war zone, or inform North Korean military tactics in the 2 years preceding the event. This was showcased in footage showing North Korean troops clearly disoriented when encountering hostile drones, in most cases being even less effective than average infantry. The lack of awareness of just how much impact drones have in the war in Ukraine has turned North Korean soldiers into nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russian army, and that may have been the entire point. And the Russian troops themselves share that same sentiment. In surveillance footage obtained by the Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence services, the North Korean troops stationed in Kursk were frequently disparaged and insulted by their Russian peers. The Russians referred to them as the K Battalion, showing their clear disdain for their would-be comrades. A particular point of contention for the Russian troops has been the fact that the North Koreans didn't speak any Russian or English. That practically insurmountable language barrier meant that North Korean troops could only rely on basic signs and verbiage while in the field, effectively leaving them in the dark in the fast-paced action of the war. The same intelligence recordings showed that the troops were supposed to be supported by 1 translator and 3 higher-ranking officers per every 30 troops, which was still an inordinate number of people to use to support around 11,000 soldiers. The 1 translator per 30 soldiers ratio, something which was unlikely to work to begin with, was typically considered to be not enough by the local Russians. Simultaneously, those translators now have to be cared for by the Russian military, putting even further strain on its resources. Some Russians were doubtful of the effectiveness of having translators on the battlefield, fearing they would significantly slow down how quickly commands could spread through scattered troops on the front line. The language barrier has also likely affected the training the troops have received while in Kursk. Considering the state of the North Korean soldiers when they arrived in the country, most reports agreed they would need weeks, if not months, of training to get up to speed with the tactics employed by the Russian military during the war, as well as the Ukrainian countermeasures. This is maybe why we didn't see many reports of North Korean troops engaging with the Ukrainian military in Kursk for the first few weeks after they arrived. When the reports did start coming in, they weren't positive. While some of the first reports implied that the North Korean soldiers had enough rote training and numbers to be a serious threat to the Ukrainian military, later ones suggested that they were already suffering heavy losses. These losses weren't entirely attributed to the lack of training and equipment either, but also to morale. The North Korean troops were essentially dragged from their isolated country into an internet-saturated one. They didn't know the language or the Russian culture, and they were treated by the Russian military on the whole as disposable. Therefore, it was no surprise to hear that within the first few weeks of arriving in Kursk, some of the North Korean troops reportedly began trying to flee the military and the country as a whole. The Ukrainian intelligence services paired with the South Korean intelligence services and North Korean refugees living in South Korea to devise an information campaign, telling the North Korean soldiers how they could actually defect from Russia into Ukraine. This undoubtedly led to the North Korean soldiers having even more doubts about their role and effectiveness on and off the battlefield. But the language issues go beyond just creating bad morale for the North Korean troops. They were practically deadly for the Russians as well. On December 17th, what should have been an overwhelming push by the combined Russian, Chechen, and North Korean forces into one of the Ukrainian-occupied areas of Kursk turned into a devastating defeat. The cause? The North Koreans confused Chechen reinforcements for incoming Ukrainian soldiers and opened fire on their convoy. They killed several soldiers and destroyed a few vehicles before the devastating misunderstanding could be corrected. Furthermore, the lack of language integration also means that whatever combined efforts are made in Kursk are being undone by the various sections of the military not being able to follow up on each other's commands. This is possibly evidenced in reports that the Russian offensives in Kursk were not reinforced with fire from the North Korean contingents in the field. When Russians inevitably decided to increase the rate of attack with artillery fire and even air bombardments, there was still a distinct lack of infantry activity in the area, completely undermining the opportunity to bring some of the Kursk area back under Russian control. The Russians have also made their share of mistakes when it comes to working with the North Koreans. When North Koreans deployed some of their anti-air defenses, Russian drone operators failed to notice that the vehicles in question were actually on their side. The defense systems, which were an old Soviet design retrofitted with North Korean improvements, if they could be called that, looked nothing like modern Russian systems and were thus destroyed by Russian drones. This could explain why Russia, with its much larger army, hasn't managed to retake control of Kursk, despite Ukraine having to split their efforts between that region and Donbass. Considering how much they've been on their back foot throughout the war, Ukraine has been surprising in the way in which they've held on to the Russian region as well. Arguably, a big part of that was that Russia somehow believed that the 11,000 North Koreans would be skilled enough to support the 40,000 native Russian troops in the region throughout the counteroffensive. It turns out the reverse might actually be the reality. Ukraine had no problem picking off both North Koreans and Russians whenever possible, and likely ridiculed their lack of tangible progress in the process. So with all of these factors in play, why has it taken so long for North Korean troops to be withdrawn? Why were they being used from October to February? Well, the first part of the answer was that they weren't really used, at least as conventional soldiers. Remember, these troops had to undergo additional training, severely limiting how many and how soon the Russian military could deploy them to the Kursk front line. Adding to the confusion is the practice of outfitting North Korean soldiers in Russian garb, making them appear to be Russians when viewed from afar. Thus, despite being on the battlefield, the North Korean troops were technically underutilized due to being untrained and seemingly unprepared for active conflict. But even if the North Korean troops were unfit for the battlefield, Russia didn't seem to have much choice in whether to employ them or not. According to the latest statistics issued by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russia has lost over 850,000 soldiers in the 3 years of the war so far. When the North Korean soldiers were spotted in Kursk, that number was around 650,000 to 700,000. At that rate of loss, it took only approximately 6 months for Russia to lose a quarter of its troops. That rate of losing soldiers is practically impossible to overcome. To make up for the losses, Russia has been firing on all cylinders when it comes to recruitment campaigns, offering contract soldiers salaries that were multiple times higher than their national average. On the conscription side, the Ministry of Defense relaxed the age requirements for the draft, which also showcased just how dire the situation was in terms of lack of manpower. This has the added effect of disproportionality affecting the poorer communities. You see, the draft and the conscription efforts have mainly targeted people outside of the big cities. With heavy conscription efforts occurring far outside Moscow, the Kremlin's propaganda campaign could convince city dwellers that the war was a foregone conclusion as a Russian victory. After all, Moscow wasn't particularly impacted by the war effort. This is at least until the first few long-range kamikaze drones managed to hit the region in September 2024. Combined with reports of Russia running low on manpower and morale starting to take a hit, urban communities finally realized just how bad the war was going for Russia. Putin needed a solution quickly, which is where Russia and North Korea's Mutual Defense Pact, signed in June 2024, came in. Shortly after inking the pact, Ukraine invaded Kursk in August. This gave Putin the perfect opportunity to call on North Korea to uphold its end of the pact and for him to outsource the role of the designated cannon fodder in Kursk to their soldiers. The Ukrainian invasion of Kursk has been a big hit to Russia's military reputation, as it showed that Ukraine didn't need foreign support to hit back at Russia. Furthermore, the Kursk invasion greatly influenced how Russia might try to approach peace talks with Ukraine. So long as Ukraine controlled a piece of Russian territory, it was practically a given that Russia wouldn't negotiate if it meant ceding some of its territory. The invasion of Kursk was also devastating for Putin for yet another reason. It gave him less ammo to use on the global geopolitical stage. China has been backing much of Russia's efforts throughout the war, and the previous ceasefire agreements that it proposed called for Ukraine to cede the territory Russia currently occupies in return for simply stopping the war, something that Zelensky would likely never agree to. But another big player could sway Putin even more: the US. With President Donald Trump winning the 2024 elections, Putin rushed his efforts to retake Kursk before the inauguration in January. The reason was that Trump was supposedly more sympathetic toward Putin than he is Zelensky, and was more likely to force NATO to stop donations to Ukraine. With the US possibly backing out of the conflict and NATO not being able to agree on donations and how to use them, Ukraine could be overwhelmed by Russia by sheer numbers and artillery. But two events have changed those plans. One, the effort to retake Kursk has failed. Second, Putin didn't anticipate that Trump's second presidential term seems to have a different focus than the first. Trump didn't immediately stop US donations to Ukraine. He argues that the war should be over by now and ostensibly has left the matter to be resolved without him, with the US basically acting on autopilot as far as future donations go. Trump has turned his attention to the local US issues first, which meant that Putin and the war were no longer in Trump's spotlight. This has probably insulted Putin even more, as he's used to getting his way throughout his time at the helm of Russia practically since 2000. Considering that Putin has previously mentioned that to negotiate peace with Ukraine, he wants to do it not with Zelensky but with Trump, and has now been rebuffed, there's little chance of the war actually stopping anytime soon, at least on Putin's current terms. Which means the entire situation in Kursk is a colossal waste of resources for Putin. For Ukraine, it doesn't really matter how much progress they've made in Kursk before stopping the offensive. They still managed to take as much land as Russia did in Donbass throughout that year before their incursion. As long as they manage to hold on to even a fraction of it, they can have a slightly elevated standing in any future peace talks. But for Russia and Putin's ambitions, Kursk was an all-or-nothing affair. So with Kursk still in Ukraine's hands, the current success, or lack thereof, of the Russian counteroffensive is obviously significant. It means that the North Korean troops are arguably no longer needed, as the current stalemate still forces Ukraine to divert at least some of its resources to Kursk instead of to Donbass. The North Korean troops have been withdrawn, at least for now, Their utter incompetence on the battlefield was doing more good for the Ukrainian effort than the Russian counteroffensive. But it's possible that Russia still plans to use those soldiers and only needs to train them better in modern warfare tactics, such as the aforementioned drone usage. Alternatively, the North Koreans might have been withdrawn because Russia could no longer afford it. The soldiers were paid the same rate as native Russians, even if practically all that money went to the North Korean government rather than the soldiers themselves. This meant they were technically contract soldiers who significantly underperformed for their cost. And Russia's economy has been taking big hits over the past 3 years. The oil sector, which is one of the country's foremost ways of making a profit, has been on the decline, as Europe has found alternative suppliers and China and India are paying less than Europe used to. Ukraine has also targeted multiple oil refineries, which are located mainly in the southwest of the country for easy export to Europe. This reduced the available resources Russia could use for trade and even caused short-term shortages of oil and gas at home, leading to export bans by Russia itself to most of the world. Additionally, not only has Russia lost people on the battlefield, but off it as well. When the invasion began in February 2022, people left the country en masse to avoid the draft, as well as escape the constant stream of Russian propaganda and the suppression of any dissent. By the end of 2022, it was estimated nearly 900,000 Russians had left the country. A majority of those people were middle to upper class people who could afford to transfer their lives and families out of Russia and stay abroad. This means that Russia has lost some of its best workers, which further damages the economy as there are not enough people to fill the newly empty positions. This lack of economic growth will likely have a long-term negative impact that will only worsen as the war rages on. So Putin will have even less money to work with to fuel his military, even with less than competent North Korean soldiers. What does this mean for the war? Well, as volatile as Putin is, he might resort to even more desperate measures unless stopped by China. On the other hand, 2025 might actually be the final year of the war, as Russia runs out of ways to support it financially and demographically. But what do you think? Will Putin try to save face and keep up the war effort, or will we see more of the North Korean soldiers later? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out North Koreans Have Had Enough, Start Killing Russian Soldiers, or click this other video instead.